Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a throwback look at the Sony Xperia Z5 Compact here in 2023. This was a smartphone that debuted in 2015, so it's by no means the newest device, although it was among a collection from Sony that provided relatively powerful specs, at least for the time, in a more compact size, which is something that is unfortunately just super rare in this day and age, and I think I'm not alone in hoping that manufacturers will decide to again make more compact flagships that are performant but easier to hold and fits into pockets better as well, as an alternative to the massive phablets which are just much more common these days. Unfortunately, the compact line from Sony is also really no longer with us, although we did do a throwback review on the slightly newer XZ2 Compact a few months back, this one coming out about 3 years afterwards. It's rocking a more powerful Snapdragon 845 processor compared to on here. It's the octa-core Snapdragon 810 chipset. It was quite capable for its time, but it doesn't have the best reputation in terms of thermal performance, so if you are pressing it super hard, it does tend to get a little bit warmer and more toasty compared to the super cool and energy efficient, well-optimized chips that Qualcomm is really known for. Otherwise, taking a closer look at the design, we have a 4.6-inch HD resolution IPS LCD screen, which does look pretty good in terms of colors and viewing angles. Now, of course, the decision to put 720p as opposed to, say, 1080 might be a little bit more controversial in 2023 standards, but I actually think it was a logical decision. It conserves on battery, and honestly, on a smaller size panel, you get a sufficient PPI that doesn't look quite as stretched out as on a bigger screen, so still is pretty decent looking. What's also nice about Sony phones is they had stereo speakers, so one at the bottom, one at the top, giving you some separation if you're listening to audio, and it continued the extremely kind of sharp corners of this industrial design, attributes we still see echoed in some of Sony's modern day smartphone design. What I do like about the Z5 Compact is it also brought a fingerprint scanner integrated onto the power key. They were one of the first manufacturers to do this, in fact, and it's very responsive and a pretty nice placement that's intuitive. Also here is a two-stage camera shutter key that you can tap on to instantly jump into the camera and also focus to snap an image, very convenient. In fact, the volume rocker also acts as zoom controls for getting closer to an object, even though it is digital zoom. What wasn't the best though was the placement was a little bit funky since it's kind of closer to the bottom edge of the phone as opposed to, say, the top side, but it is what it is, you kind of get used to it. And despite the phone being constructed mainly out of polycarbonate plastic for the rails, it still looked relatively sleek and felt premium enough in the hands, plus a little bit more durable. It does have water resistance as well, which is kind of a staple we've come to expect from Sony devices. There's also a lanyard strap, and underneath this flap is where you can find the SIM card as well as a micro SD card for expanding the built-in memory. As expected from the times, there was a regular analog 3.5mm headphone jack, which is also suitable for a Sony device because they have a pretty good Walkman MP3 player app built in as well, and it uses a more conventional micro USB port there at the bottom for charging, since USB Type-C really wasn't a thing just yet. It came out with Android 5 and was upgraded all the way to 7.0 Nougat, so it was 2 OS level upgrades, which was actually a pretty good run from Sony, I would say, and their Xperia UI is thankfully super clean, just with a splash of additional customization in terms of colors and some additional Sony apps built on in, but aside from that, you have just the stock Google apps built in here, and there's not too much bloatware going on. Still feels rather uncluttered and relatively responsive even on a hardware here that's not kind of the newest anymore. With that being said, it was paired with 2GB of RAM, which looking back was a little on the stingy side, so multitasking performance is not going to be the best in the world, although you can still load up, say, 2 or 3 apps and it will still do an okay job. Anything more than that, it will start to reload more quickly in the background. Connectivity options, though, are fairly full-featured, including built-in GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, although Qi wireless charging wasn't quite available on this device. Although what was neat was the Z5 Compact did come in a variety of quite vibrant-looking colors, from yellows to more of a pinkish red, as well as more conventional black and white options, of course. Jumping into the camera to take a quick look, it is a single lens solution, but it was a pretty high 23 megapixel sensor that Sony added on the Z5 Compact. And looking back, there are some interesting things that Sony's app did, including recognition of different scenes to adjust some of the photo properties, which would be, of course, branded as quote-unquote AI by companies in this day and age. But this was just known as Intelligent Auto back in the day and worked decently. The UI is rather clean, but also gave you different controls, including a more manual mode if you desired, for adjusting properties like ISO, white balance, HDR. It was quite easy to use, especially with the ergonomic controls on the top, made shooting quite convenient. Additional extras include the ability to toggle into 4K video recording, different AR stickers, which may be a little bit gimmicky, but was kind of the rage back in 2015. Panoramic shots, as well as even portrait-style photos can be taken, although it takes a little bit longer for processing because it has just one lens. It will stitch two photos together and then estimate depth using some additional processing afterwards. The general consensus about Sony phones from this time, though, was despite the use of a flagship-grade camera sensor, super high resolution, very detailed, optimization tends to be a little bit lacking. That is, considering Sony sells their camera hardware to tons of other companies, what is a little unfortunate is the end result perhaps isn't quite as consistent as, say, certain iPhones and Google Pixel devices that might be using lens technology from them. But just because those companies put more support into the software optimization, what happens after you click on snap, and further processing those photos. But they have made great strides in more recent generations to further improve on, but still a pretty decent shooter when it comes to detail and resolution. Otherwise, when it comes to the software experience, as aforementioned, very clean. There's access to a PlayStation app, as well as some media apps for accessing music, as well as videos, with, again, a fairly elegant UI that made it nice for listening to music as something like an iPod alternative. What Sony was also ahead of the time in, I think, was placing these virtual keys at the bottom instead of having them placed onto the bezel section of the panel, and as a result, it can hide itself when not being used, although obviously gesture support wasn't added to Android at this time yet. With that being said, what's also neat is you can still update the Play Store and also Google apps, so you can still have a pretty up-to-date experience there when it comes to accessing services like Gmail, the assistant for voice queries. Those services can still be fully featured. And despite the smaller size, I don't find it to be too cramped either when it comes to doing the basics. Even typing feels relatively comfortable, though I suspect that's probably because of the slightly more conventional 16:9 aspect ratio panel here, as opposed to the more narrow 2:1 that we're used to these days. Gives you just a little bit more room to work with as you are typing on the panel here, that does also support swipe as well. Transitioning into a quick demo of the speaker quality and video playback using YouTube next. So some takeaways here being that stereo separation is definitely a nice function to have, just adds a little bit more immersion as you're watching back videos. Plus again, you can use standard headphones or Bluetooth to connect to wireless headphones as well. The screen quality here really isn't shabby despite it not being AMOLED and not the largest in the world, but again, viewing angles are still relatively generous, and for just playing back some quick YouTube clips, it still seems to be faring alright. Reception quality was never really an issue that this phone had problems with, especially with the more plastic chassis on the rails. Overall, dual-band Wi-Fi works without too many problems, in addition to 4G LTE, so loading speeds and buffering isn't something you have to really worry about. With that being said, the 2GB of RAM does mean that if you are running on latest versions of certain apps, which are heavier, you will start to notice moments of occasional hesitation, combined with, again, the processor here starting to age a little bit. It's kind of comparable to, I would say, a budget-end phone in terms of processing hardware by 2023 standards. So it will still get around, but you have to just be a little bit more patient in terms of animations. But once things do load up, it still is a serviceable experience, I would say. Now, of course, with a smaller screen, you do have to expect a smaller battery pack as well. This is a 2,700 milliamp-hour capacity cell, but coupled with a screen which isn't going to be super high on power consumption, it can still mostly last through a day of usage, of moderate use that is, unless you are pressing it super hard with things like gaming, which honestly just really isn't recommended because of the lower-end hardware here coupled with the small amount of RAM. You're not going to get a great experience anymore if you are playing back more modern, competitive games. But simple ones like Stack, Angry Birds, Crossy Road, those titles will still work, but again, expect just slightly longer loading times. But you can also find older versions of those apps as well, slightly more optimized for hardware of its age, and they will load a little bit more quickly. But again, for things like basics, for listening to music, even streaming it from Spotify, some light web browsing, it can certainly still handle without too many complaints. In fact, taking just a quick look at that, visiting the Verge's website, and as you can tell here, you will have to just wait for a couple seconds longer for things to snap into focus, but once they do, and this is a fairly complex web page, you can still do an okay job. Some of the elements here are still rendering, but pinch to zoom certainly still feels smooth enough, and again, it still is a pretty usable enough experience, I would say, if we're just looking at some quick articles, as well as, again, watching back some quick clips, as long as you give an extra second or two for things to snap into focus. And here's the full desktop version of the site that you can also load back. It will take just a couple seconds longer compared to more modern architecture phones, but for the most part usable, though of course on a smaller panel you'll have to do slightly more zooming around to read back longer articles and smaller text details. But surprisingly, again, not too shabby of an experience. Otherwise, aside from site customization that Sony made on top of the Android UI, such as their own clock app, as you can see there, some built-in defaults also included what was called Track ID. It's very similar to what Google Pixel phones have. If you play a few seconds of music, for example, at a store, it's able to recognize the song name. Sony also has their own movie editor tool built on in. So if you take clips, you're able to more quickly apply templates, stitch them together, trim those clips as well, doing some light editing on this phone. And as long as you don't go crazy or overboard, it still seems to mostly hold up, although again, the phone will get a little bit more toasty and warm as you are pressing it harder with some of those more intensive GPU-related tasks. So that is more or less it as far as kind of a revisited look back at this Sony Xperia Z5 Compact. On one hand, it makes me nostalgic for the days when Sony was making phones more for the mainstream consumers out there, I would say. Their devices were just a little bit more popular on the Android space, especially as they had carrier variants in the US, and they weren't really focusing on just ultra premium phones, and also the days when, again, compact flagships could still be found. These days your options are just a lot more limited unless you're looking at an Asus Zenfone. You don't really have too many other options floating around unless you pick up an older device. In this case, I would say if you are looking after a slightly older Sony device, I would personally still skew towards something like the XC2, just because it does have a kind of newer software, a more powerful and energy efficient processor. Again, the 845, which is just more capable, and many of the same functions, including waterproofing, stereo speaker support, although it does lose the regular headphone jack, which is a little bit of a shame. But overall, it's going to be a more usable device in terms of responsiveness by 2023 standards. But nonetheless, it's still a very iconic looking phone in the Z5's case, with that side-mounted fingerprint scanner, the super boxy shape, as well as the vibrant color options that it came with.